Hi guys, and welcome to today's video. So in today's video, I'm going to talk about how you can gain working experience or where you can find volunteering for yourself if you'd like to become a therapist or a counsellor in the future. I often get asked about what things you can do to gain experience, especially when you're applying for your master's or doctorate course. So I thought I'd make a video explaining all the different ways that you can try to improve your experience and where you can volunteer in order to increase your chances of being accepted onto your master's course or your PhD. So I'm going to talk about a variety of places where you can volunteer or places where you can work that will enhance your application for your master's or your PhD. So the first one, which I think most people are aware of, is volunteering for a helpline, especially a mental health care helpline such as NSPCC, Childline, the Samaritans, Shout, and the Salvation Army, and so many others. Those are just the ones in the UK. So of all of these, they are always looking for volunteers and they are usually virtual. So most of them are telephone services, but some of them also offer texting options, like Shout is exclusively a texting service. And there are some that also would do email services and video calls. So these helplines exist to provide emotional support to those who need it. So in this case, you would be able to practice some counselling skills and you'd be able to gain a little bit of experience on what it's like to help somebody going through emotional distress or somebody who's looking for support, or how to just be an active listener, or how to be empathetic to people going through different situations. And of course, you'll be exposed to people going through a variety of different things. So in this case, you'd be able to practice that side of improving your counselling skills and just enhancing your listening skills as well. So with a role like this, you'll normally have a few weeks or a few months of training. And after you've done your training, then you'll be able to shadow somebody, and then you'll be able to eventually start. And once you start, you'll have somebody with you, guiding you, just making sure that you're okay and making sure that you don't feel overwhelmed. So you can always take a break if you need some guidance or if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed after a certain phone call. And then the more you do it, the more you'll be eventually able to kind of do it on your own. So I remember before I started my master's, I had applied for Childline and I was about to start the training to be able to volunteer with them. But then, of course, the pandemic started and I couldn't go ahead with it. So I never got the opportunity to practice this and to actually do it. But I remember that the training was going to be quite rigorous. It was going to be for quite a while and they expected me to commit to them for about a year or two. So that's also something to keep in mind if you want to volunteer with a helpline, that most of them will expect quite a bit from you. Even if it's not necessarily the time, but the commitment that they want from you, it can be quite a lot. So some of the criteria that they have is that you must be 18 or over. Some of them might allow you if you're 16, but I doubt it. So it's just good to check. So if you're somebody who's not sure if you want to go to uni or you want to take a gap year, you can still do this from the age of 18. And like I already said before, most of these places will expect you to be with them for at least a minimum of 6 months, if not longer, maybe 1 year or 2 years. So ensure that you have the time and the means to be able to commit to the service for at least a year or two, if not longer. And the other thing that I remember from when I applied for Childline was that they would expect you to commit maybe 1 to 3 different days. But it wouldn't be a full day. It would be like maybe a 3 or 4 hour shift. So maybe a Thursday afternoon from like 12 till 3 p.m. or a Friday evening from 5 p.m. to 8 p.m. So it's not going to be a case of you're there for the whole day, but you commit to a certain time and you stick to that time and it works around your schedule and your availability. But the time that you choose is the time that you should commit to. So those are the main kinds of criteria you need to think about. And also just be aware and take time to reflect on yourself. If you're in the right place to be able to listen to other people's problems, if you're able to take on other people's problems, because let's say you're grieving, for example, or you've just gone through a breakup, probably not the best time to volunteer and then have to hear about other people's problems, especially if someone is talking about something similar to what you're going through. It can be very triggering. So just be mindful of where you're at. And it's not just about gaining the volunteering experience, but can you also just be able to give the best of yourself to somebody who needs the support. So if you yourself are in need of support, take the time to take care of yourself first before you volunteer for a role like this, because you're going to be talking to people who are going through a lot of things and you never know what to expect, because it's not like counselling where you have a client that comes in week after week with a certain issue. You're going to be speaking to different people from all walks of life going through very different things. So be mindful of that as well. So this is something that can definitely look good on your application. but I know some universities don't really care for volunteering experiences like this. So if you're able to get a face-to-face experience, try and get face-to-face experience where you're providing emotional support in a one-to-one role rather than telephone. But this is better than nothing, and you still get to practice active listening, you still get to practice empathy, unconditional positive regard, and a whole host of other counselling skills. So don't knock this out of the park just because a university might not find it that helpful, but it's just good for you to improve on your skills as a future counsellor. At number 2, we have working or volunteering in a mental health hospital or mental health institute. So if you've been watching my channel for a while, you'll know that I work in a mental health hospital, and this is something I talked about in my master's application to help, and it did help when I spoke about my experience working in mental health as a healthcare assistant, where I was in direct contact with people with varying mental health issues, from schizophrenia to depression to personality disorders of all sorts. So that was also quite helpful for me. So if you're able to find a mental health hospital near you that's either got vacancies or volunteering roles, try and apply for that so that you can be in contact with people who are experiencing mental health issues, and you have time to be around them and to talk to them and provide emotional support for them. That's something that would look really good on your application as well. So like I said, this could be paid or unpaid depending on the availability at the hospital that you're applying for, but this is something to look into. And what I would say is that before you apply for whatever university you want to go to, try and have done this job or this volunteering role for at least 6 months prior, because I remember vaguely my university had said, don't say that you've only done this job for only 1 month and then put it on your application and talk about what you've learned from it. They would want you to have done this for at least 6 months or more to show that you've actually learned something from it and you've gained something from it, and you can actually speak about it from a place of experience. In my application, I remember they also asked me about paid and unpaid roles. So it doesn't really matter whether the role that you're doing is paid or unpaid, but the fact that I was working face-to-face and in direct contact with patients who had mental health issues was very helpful. So that's something also to keep in mind. If you're able to get that, that would be really helpful for your application. So if you're not able to apply for a healthcare assistant role, there are other roles that are similar or with similar names like support worker, and you could also apply for a role as a psychology assistant. As long as it's a role within a hospital that allows you to be in contact with patients who are experiencing mental health issues, then that's a good role. Don't apply for something random like catering or cleaning, where you're not actually able to interact with the patients or be able to provide any kind of support to them. You could also volunteer as a psychology student at a mental health hospital if that role is available. At the hospital where I work, they do have psychology students who volunteer there sometimes. So if you can find any sort of psychology related or counselling related volunteer roles or jobs that you know you'll be accepted for, apply for those as well, because that will also look really good on your application. And once again, try and make sure you do the role for at least 6 months before you apply for whatever university you want to go to. So moving on to the third option. If you're hoping to do a master's or a PhD, you could also volunteer as a research assistant. This can make your application look really good. And even though it's not really directly correlated to counselling experience, you're obviously going to have to do a piece of research at master's or doctorate level anyway. So the fact that you have research experience is going to look good, and it's going to probably make you stand out amongst other people who only have mental health care experience or who only have helping role experience. So if you also have research experience on top of that, that will really make you stand out because they already know you're capable of doing well. So if you're currently a university student, whether that's undergrad or you're already doing a different master's, you could try and ask some of your lecturers if they are conducting research and if you can volunteer for them. When I was doing my undergrad, I remember one of our lecturers on the psychology cohort, she was looking for research assistants, and me and one other girl got the role, and it was a volunteering role, but she was able to write me and her a reference for our universities, and that was really helpful. So if you're able to, ask and inquire any of your lecturers if you can volunteer for them as a research assistant. And if you can't find one within your department, extend and look wider within the university. It doesn't just have to be psychology. But what I would recommend, if you're going to volunteer for a researcher, try and volunteer for qualitative research rather than quantitative research, simply because when you go on to do your master's or your PhD, you're most likely going to be doing qualitative research rather than quantitative, because that's what most counselling research papers tend to be. So it's not the end of the world if you can't volunteer for somebody who's doing qualitative research. You can still do quantitative, I did my research assistant role for somebody who was doing quantitative research, and she was still able to give me a reference. So it's not the end of the world. So that's also something to keep in mind if you're able to control that. Next up, we have the role of an assistant psychologist. Now, this role is usually very competitive and it's not easy to get into, especially if you don't have the qualifications, especially if you're still doing your degree, because it requires you to have a degree. However, if you're able to maybe spend a year before your master's or your PhD to do this role, this would look really great on your application and it would increase your chances of getting accepted onto your course very quickly. I personally didn't apply for this role. I've never done this role, so I can't speak on the process or what it's like or what to expect in terms of the interview or even the role itself. However, I know that when I was applying, this was something that they would have really appreciated, and this is something that would have definitely boosted my application. But if you're able to do this in the year that you're maybe taking out to do your counselling skills diploma, if you don't already have one, you could also do this role at the same time, and that would really boost your application. So I hope that helps. But just to keep in mind, if you're wondering when you can volunteer, how you can volunteer, try and make time for this while you're doing your undergrad if possible, or even during your summer holidays. If you're a student at university, you tend to have quite long summer holidays. So if you're able to volunteer during your summer holidays, or even if you're doing undergrad that's part-time, try and volunteer alongside that. Try not to wait until maybe a few months before you have to apply for your course. Try and do this when you've got a bit of time. Most of these roles don't require too much from you. Most of them might only require one day or a few hours a week. So try and fit them in wherever you can. You don't have to give a whole year or a whole 6 months to it fully. You can just do it part-time alongside other things that you're doing. So you may be wondering why I didn't mention certain roles like befriending or shadow work. I didn't mention those roles because most universities won't find them helpful. Most universities don't actually want you to speak about any of these roles. Most of them don't find them relevant or helpful to your application. So if you've done them and it's the only experience you have, I would recommend try and do some of the other things I've mentioned, because most universities won't be moved or impressed by the fact that you've done befriending work or shadow work at all. So it won't help your application. That's why I didn't mention them. You can add them to your application if you really want to, if it's the only thing you have, but don't be disappointed if the university doesn't find that to be enough reason to accept your application. So I hope that's helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.